Can you hear me? Is that thumbs
Yep.
up from people? Brilliant. Okay. So let me share my screen. Hold on a second. I've never had such a lovely introduction before, which has had the word wackadoodle in it. So I'll leave you to hold that word in mind, because you may actually be interpreting me as a wackadoodle when we get to the end, but that's absolutely fine. So here we go. Yes, so thank you very much, Dawn, for inviting me along. I just want to take you through kind of a little bit of a context in terms of who I am, and then focus on two particular things that Dawn had asked me to focus on for this particular group. This is me. I always kind of do these general introductory talks as kind of researching the weird and wonderful. Why? Because I'm a parapsychologist, which I'll define in a minute, but I'm fascinated by every aspect of the paranormal, and have been, you know, for years and years and years. So even though we talk about parapsychology, my remit and my interest even goes beyond parapsychology. It all started with this. This is when it started for me as a young teenage boy, seeing this particular film and thinking, this is what I want to do. I want to be a Ghostbuster. And effectively, I've never stopped. I don't have a proton pack. I don't have a fancy car, but I'm in a career that I've carved out for myself where effectively I'm a parapsychologist, but I'm also a Ghostbuster. I'm still out in the field kind of researching ghosts rather than just stuck in the lab like Dr. Venkman there in the bottom right-hand corner. But let me explain a little bit about parapsychology and what it is. Parapsychology is three areas: ESP, which is extrasensory perception, PK, and then the third area of study is survival or after-death communication. When we talk about ESP, a lot of these terms may be very familiar with you. ESP, the alleged abilities would be telepathy, or mind-to-mind communication, precognition, predicting the future, and then lastly, clairvoyance. But clairvoyance, when we talk about it in parapsychology, we do mean seeing without your eyes. So we often talk about mediumship ability, clairvoyance, you're seeing spirit, but it's not just that. It doesn't have to be spirit. You could also just see generally without your eyes. And a classic way, a good way of explaining that is if you did a drawing and put it in an envelope and asked me to work out what it was, I might use clairvoyance to see into the envelope. But if I'm accurate, is it because I saw in the envelope using some clairvoyant ability, or is it because of telepathy, mind to mind? I got the drawing from your mind. Or is it because when you asked me, I suddenly remembered a dream that I'd had 3-4 days ago in which you asked me about a drawing in an envelope and I recalled the dream. So it would be an example of precognition. Now, those two things are then sometimes difficult to disentangle and distinguish, which is why we say ESP as a general term. PK, on the other hand, psychokinesis, is the movement of objects with your mind. And that could be a number of different things, but certainly the most commonly known example of PK is spoon bending. Uri Geller being a prime example of an individual that claims to have a PK ability. And having witnessed it myself, here's a signed spoon from him that he gave me, which I'm very proud to own. But that would be an example of what we call macro PK. We can see that PK happening. It's in front of us, the same way that in some ghost hunting approaches, but also on TV shows, you sometimes see people standing around a table and willing the table to move, or trying to get the spirit to move the table. Now, of course, it might be people pushing it. If it happens, it might be the spirit moving it. But some parapsychologists say, well, that could be an example of group PK. You're willing that to happen. So that's all macro PK. If an object levitates or moves, we can see it. Micro PK, on the other hand, is PK that we cannot necessarily see. So we need some sort of monitoring equipment to see it. And there's been some amazing work done in Princeton, of all places, Princeton University back in the 80s and 90s, where they were looking at the ability of people to affect the decay of radioactive material. You can't see it happening, but you need some way of assessing it. Another example of micro PK that's very different is something called the staring effect. Have you ever been on a bus or in a situation where you feel like somebody's staring at the back of your head and you look around and they are? That's what we might call micro PK, that is having an influence on the person in front of you. And it's important to remember some of these definitions when we get on to me talking about infrasound and something called the Dragon Project, because it has an influence there. The other thing to bear in mind is poltergeist activity. When we talk about poltergeist, which might be a word you know, a form of spirit activity or form of a haunting, some parapsychologists think that it's not a spirit, but it's us causing that phenomena to happen. The last area of study is after-death communication, sometimes called survival, and the vast majority of evidence for that is hauntings and mediumship. So the context is, within the world today, there are 200-300 maybe parapsychologists who are qualified up to doctorate level and operating and doing research. The majority of them research ESP. My particular area of interest and expertise is within after-death communication and survival and that sort of thing. And I'm fascinated by ghosts and the idea of ghostly experiences. But as a parapsychologist, as a scientist, I'm always thinking about the explanations, the people's stories, but also the possible explanations for what's going on. When we talk about haunting experiences, we're not just talking about seeing a ghost, though. We're talking about any sensory experience. You can hear, see, feel, touch, even just get a sense that there's a person there. All of that is an example of a haunting experience. But there are many different explanations, and I'm not going to go into all of these because I want to focus on two in particular, or the infrasound one, and then have time for the Dragon Project. So infrasound as a possible environmental explanations for people experience that's put forward. Infrasound is low frequency sound. So it's sound that's below 20 hertz. And the best way of trying to explain it is, whilst we still hear it, we actually feel it in our body. And so if you've been in a place where there's loud music, or a club or a bar or something like that, loud music, or a car goes past and it's very, very loud, big speakers, you feel it in your body, you feel it in the pit of your stomach. Well, that's not infrasound, but it's getting very close to it. It's low frequency sound. Infrasound below 20 hertz, we feel it. And this graph illustrates, don't worry about trying to understand it. You don't need to understand it. The only thing you need to be aware of about this graph is this is basically showing all of this here is the area in which we hear. So if there are any musicians listening in, when we're talking about, I think it's concert A, the A that's tuned, the orchestra's tuned to, that's around 440 hertz, kind of the middle of that piano. So as we go down to infrasonic level, you get down and down and down, and it can have quite a serious physical impact on you if it's quite prolonged that's happened. But the interesting thing about infrasound is there's some research done by Vic Tandy based at Coventry University, an engineer who's now unfortunately passed away. And he was saying that he had an experience in the lab where he saw a shadow move out of the corner of his eye and just kind of felt a sense of presence. And he attributed that to an oscillating fan in the laboratory that was oscillating around 18 hertz. And he then put forward this theory that infrasound could be a possible explanation for people's haunting experiences. So much so that he went and did a survey at a haunted cellar in Coventry, finding that same frequency around 18 hertz. It was actually 18.7 hertz, 18 hertz, and a haunted cellar where people had reported a sense of presence and kind of fleeting apparitions. And he again was saying, well, that proves my theory about the presence of infrasound. This, for me, has been an interesting journey in terms of looking at infrasound for two reasons. I wear a hat as a parapsychologist, but I also wear a hat as a musician and a music psychologist. So the concept of sound I find fascinating anyway. And I've been involved in a number of projects looking at this idea of, can infrasound affect you in such a way that gives you those haunting experiences, to the point where I set up a concert with some physicist and musician friends of mine at the Royal Festival Hall about 20 years ago, where we played infrasound to the audience unsuspectingly, and just wanted to get a measure of how it would affect their experience of the concert. And we measured their emotional response, and sure enough, people had an increased intensity of an emotional response when infrasound was present. So we had 2 concerts back to back, and we varied where infrasound was so we could compare them. And people's emotional intensity increased. They had the emotion regardless. And that's what I find fascinating about infrasound and some of the research that I've done in that, but also in doing research generally, is that we now feel as though infrasound adds to the intensity of an experience, and that experience may already be in existence, but it happens. It, in effect, is kind of counter to what Vic Tandy and the theory is, which is infrasound explains hauntings. It may be more so that the haunting experience exists, but infrasound can add to it in some way, kind of making it more powerful and more intense. And just a quick word, when we're talking about infrasound, this concept, there are man-made sources and natural sources of infrasound. So earthquakes, for example, is a prime example of a natural source. Thunder as well produces infrasound. Man-made sources, there are many. You talked about kind of oscillating fans or air conditioning units. Heavy traffic can cause infrasound, various things, even long tunnels. And if air or wind moves through it in a particular way, it can cause an infrasonic note in much the same way that you see in church organs. The concept of a church organ and a big pipe. Church organs, effectively, you press a key on a keyboard and it rushes air through the pipe and it produces a note. Well, interestingly, when I was doing research on infrasound, we realized that there are some church organs in cathedrals in the UK and actually in North America that have pipes that are infrasonic. There's no actual note that comes out of them at all. And we're asking some of the contemporary builders of these things, why are you doing this? Why are you adding an infrasonic pipe when there's no actual note? And some of them said, oh, it's a useful way to up the bill and make more money because it's just an expensive draft. Others said it's to add a sense of profundity, a sense of presence to it. And so if you're in the UK, St Albans Cathedral, Westminster Cathedral, 2 prime examples of where there are church organs where they have an infrasonic pipe. And when you hear a piece of music and that infrasonic pipe is added to it, it kind of really adds to the sense that there's something there, you're feeling something. In Atlanta, there's a church organ. Thinking about North America, there's not church organ, an organ in a concert hall in Atlanta. So whatever the main concert hall is in Atlanta, there's a similar sort of one.
It's called the Fox Theater.
Perfect, thank you.
Oh no, that's a different Atlanta. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No, this isn't Atlanta.
You went to it. You would agree.
Yeah, this isn't Atlanta here. Don't worry. This isn't Atlanta. This is Liverpool. But yes, thank you for that. I knew there was an organ in Atlanta, so it's lovely to hear that.
I'm in Georgia, girl. Yeah.
I'm in Georgia. Part of my studies have been looking at infrasound and the effect, like I said, Royal Festival Hall, but also here's St George's Hall in Liverpool, where we played infrasound. You can see there 2 pipes on the corner there that produced infrasound. And again, to see how does this affect people, albeit in a musical context, but kind of trying to get an idea of how it affects people generally, just to prove that I was part of that. There's me on stage introducing it. Now, the interesting and fascinating thing for me about infrasound is that we're showing that it can have an effect on people. I did some interesting work in a place called Camelaird, which is a shipbuilding yard in Birkenhead, in the northwest of England, kind of Liverpool direction, across the river from Liverpool. And there was a Camelot shipbuilding offices where people have reported odd things for many, many years in the offices there. And actually what we found was that we were putting individuals in that environment. And if we put them in particular places, they would report odd things. They report that things happen. But it wasn't 100% reliable in terms of them always reporting things. But actually, when we put mediums through that same process, mediums that weren't aware of the previous explanations or previous experiences that people had had, we could almost map the office in terms of an infrasound survey and go, well, look, there's infrasound occurring in this office building here, but actually you can map it. So when we talk about sound, of course, you talk about a sound wave, this idea, sound waves, and there are going to be peaks and troughs. There's going to be points where it's stronger compared to other places. And what was interesting when we had mediums walk around is at the points where infrasound was at its strongest, the mediums would suddenly start opening up and say, I'm getting this particular figure here, I'm getting this here, I'm feeling the energy, and they would either interpret the energy, or they would start to report things about whatever energy was there or whatever spirit was there. There's two ways of looking at this, which I find absolutely fascinating. On the one hand, is infrasound acting as a trigger, so it's affecting physically the mediums, so that they interpret something's happening to their body, and they then are reinterpreting that as some sort of presence of spirit, and kind of using the imagination either consciously or subconsciously and coming up with information. Or, which myself and my colleague at the time, my PhD student at the time, thought, which is the more paranormal explanation, is actually, is it acting as a trigger, but a paranormal trigger? Effectively, is it acting as something where we found that mediums were more sensitive to the presence of this sound versus, the ghost hunters that we're putting through? You get sporadic kind of detection of infrasound from these other individuals, but mediums were consistently picking up on areas where we knew that there was a strong presence of infrasound, and then talk about these things was potentially that a trigger, kind of almost affecting them in some way, that there's suddenly it's opening a doorway in which they're then able to get all of this information coming through. So I kind of throw that out there as a possible explanation. And I'll come back to infrasound in a minute. I'm just going to share some lovely photos of haunted places in the UK, and not just the UK, but it's relevant because these are all places where we've looked at infrasound, but also places that I've visited that kind of lead on to the next part, which is the Dragon Project. So that was Hampton Court Palace. This is Mary King's Close in Edinburgh. This is the Hellfire Caves in West Wickham, actually about 10 minutes away from where I'm sitting now. If I was able to, I could probably zoom in and catch the top of that building right now. This is Dracula's Castle in Romania, which I was privileged to be able to investigate. A little aside, and please don't share this recording on social media. This is known as Dracula's Castle because Vlad the Impaler, which was the inspiration behind the Dracula figure, lived here for 2 weeks when he was 6 years old. So that's why it's called Dracula's Castle. Tourism. Eastern State Penitentiary, another favourite of mine. Oxford Castle, which is a prison, but one of the oldest buildings in Oxford, fascinating building. And I'm sharing these because these are all my favourites, but I don't know if you can see there's some sort of similarity between these, apart from the age. When we talk about infrasound and kind of these long corridors, you've got here in Hampton Court Palace, here what's called the Haunted Gallery that goes along there, a long, thin corridor. Mary King's Close, presence of infrasound that's caused by the law courts next door. Mary King's Hellfire Caves, you can't see it here, but when you go through that entrance, you go into a long tunnel. The same as here, when you go into Dracula's Castle, there's a particular corridor where people report. Eastern State Penitentiary, of course, has that same look. I'm not saying infrasound explains everything. I'm throwing out the research there that I've done on infrasound, but I think it's a fabulous concept. The key thing is, though, it doesn't explain people having experiences. And that's the key research that we found. People have the experiences regardless. Infrasound is adding to that intensity, but there might be an aspect of that interpretation of the physical phenomena that you're experiencing as a result of infrasound kind of adding to that effect. But it leads on to kind of the next part that Dawn wanted me to mention briefly, which is something called the Dragon Project. So that's all parapsychology, the stuff that I've talked about. But I get involved in a lot of field research in terms of hauntings, but also stuff that's outside of the remit of parapsychology. So I get involved in religious phenomena a lot, because kind of the claims of miracles and that sort of thing. So this is an example of one of my favorite cases, which is the case of San Pantaleon and the miracle blood of San Pantaleon, similar to the phenomena associated with Lourdes, for example, kind of similar sort of miracles. So I get involved in a lot of this peripheral research that happens outside of parapsychology. And it's as a result of all of this that I got involved in the Dragon Project, which is a particular project that was led by Paul Devereux, who's a fascinating individual who kind of in the 80s put together this Dragon Project that had a number of different aspects to it, but a lot of it was centered around ancient stones. So you've heard of Stonehenge. In the UK, there are many, many of these kind of stone circles, but also stone temples and kind of ancient stones that sit around, especially Cornwall. There are parts of Wales, Scotland as well. Now, Paul Devereux was saying, look, I don't feel the construction of these was accidental in terms of how they were constructed and where they were constructed. And there's a kind of a side project kind of looking at ley lines and that sort of thing. But actually, he was saying there's something about these locations. And what I want to do is look at a number of different things, look at the ley line stuff, look at potential infrasound, look at electromagnetic fields, these sorts of things. But also what I'd be interested in is I want to put volunteers into these environments and find out what imagery they come up with. And so I've volunteered to be part of the project and ended up going down to Cornwall, almost the southwestern tip, to a particular ancient set of stones called Carnanuni, with a colleague of mine. And effectively what Paul had us do was that one of us would sleep, and then at the point where we slip into REM, rapid eye movement, and we're in that deep sleep, we'd be woken up by our colleague and have to report the dreams. What are you dreaming about? And you report your dream imagery and then eventually go back to sleep. And then the next time you slip into deep sleep, you report your dreams and then go back to sleep again, and then deep sleep. And by the third time, you're not interested in reporting their imagery, you're just interested in shouting and swearing at your colleague for waking you up 3 times. But it was a fascinating project, because effectively what Paul was saying was, it feels as though when we start to look at some of the environmental aspects, that these people were setting up these stones and setting up either the circles or setting up places like Carnanuni and some of these places where they would worship deliberately, because they had some insight about the environment. But also what he was finding was that volunteers, when they were going to particular areas, were having similar sorts of dreams. They were reporting similar sort of imagery, but even to the extent where when I was there, so we took turns because we were only meant to be there one night, as I remember, and we ended up staying, was it the second night or maybe a night or 2 later, so that we could each have a turn. I remember having the most vivid dreams. Simple as that. It might have been the circumstance, it might have been the suggestion effect, it might have been just been sleeping outdoors as opposed to, in a tent or in somewhere comfortable. But we had a camp bed, and lay down in that. But I remember having the absolute most vivid dreams. But although there wasn't necessarily commonality across all of the sites, the volunteers that were in particular areas had commonality between them, if that makes any sense in terms of some of the imagery that came through. Fascinating. It was a project that went on for about 30 years, effectively, called the Dragon Project, and you can find out information online about it. Unfortunately, that we never really saw an end to it. I think because he was so invested in doing lots of different things, and there was ley line stuff involved as well, and you can find out some of those ley line maps in, you know, on sites that I can share with Dawn in terms of where they lie in relation to some of these ancient sites, and he was kind of showing that side of things. But yeah, we never really got kind of a finish to it. But there are a few write-ups, and again, I could share links with you, Dawn. But it's I wanted to share it with you because it feels like a natural step on from talking about infrasound, but also a natural step on in terms of talking about kind of that peripheral fringe research that I was part of. And that's it. I'm just interested to hear your thoughts, interested to hear your questions. If Dawn wanted me to add anything, I'm more than happy to add anything. But if you've got any questions about anything I've said, then please do fire away.
Thank you, Kieran. That's, as always, your work prompts more questions than gives me answers, which is what I like about it. But would love to open it up to people for thoughts, comments, questions. Just unmute and ask Kieran. Yvette.
So, sorry, going back to when you started, not sure I'm going to say it right, psychokinesis?
Yes, psychokinesis, yeah.
So do you think, is that linked to does that have a part in the collective consciousness?
Oh, that's a really good question. And the answer is yes. Not necessarily from my perspective, because, you know, I'm more skeptical in terms of my approach to parapsychology than others, but don't think that that means I'm cynical. I'm not closed-minded in any way. I'm completely open-minded. But I say yes, because there are some amazing researchers that have done exactly that. They've argued that a global consciousness is almost as a result of, you know, a kind of a collective PK effort, even to the point where, again, I can dig out one of these sites and share it with Dawn, and therefore share it with the group. There is I think it's called the Global Consciousness Project, where effectively they were looking at what are called random number generators, kind of that have been used in parapsychology for decades, in experimental work looking at PK. So are people able to affect random number generators? And it's a lovely controlled way of doing it. But what effectively this Global Consciousness Project was doing was saying, is there a sense of these devices and other measurement devices being affected in situations where there is something that affects the global consciousness in a positive and negative way? So, for example, 9/11. And you look at the data on which the project has put forward, and they say, well, look, globally, at that particular point, there was a global reaction to that. And then if you look at the PK data that we have here, it's showing that at that particular point, when that happened, these devices were affected in some way. Almost there was a group unconscious effort to affect these things. And I'm not sure the detail in terms of where they're placed. They're placed all over the world, and kind of the nature of how they've developed some of these measurement devices. But I just think it's fascinating that they've got data that shows these things are not affected at other times, but they're affected at these points of global effect, global emotional effect, where you get 9/11 and Diana's funeral as well. There's an effect. For example, Princess Diana's funeral was another one. I can't think of any other, but that's in answer to your question. Yvette, was it that asked the question? Is that the kind of thing that you're saying, that you're asking about?
Yes, because I haven't, I know little about PK, but I'm quite interested in the sort of collective consciousness as it were. I think there's stuff going, well, in England, I think there's stuff going on that is affecting the collective consciousness. But I'm interested to have a look. I will read some more about that. So thank you.
There's another part to this, which I think is worth saying. I don't want to go too much into PK in case there are other questions. There's a form of PK which is called DMILS, which is direct mental interaction of living systems. And that is a line of research within PK, which is not about our ability to affect objects, but it's about our ability to affect living things. And the example I gave was what we call the staring effect. When you stare at people, it was almost like their body reacts. Like the staring at the back of your head, your body reacts first, and you're interpreting that and turn around. So that's an interaction living system, but it's been done in loads of other examples as well. There's a lovely DMILS experiment that was done by Dawn, I'm sure we've talked about this, Serena Roney-Dougal in Glastonbury in Somerset, looking at the effect of healers kind of affecting the growth of distressed seeds. Kind of, is there a possible way that we can look at, or we can do control studies with healers, very pertinent to this particular group, kind of look at healers, but from a DMILS perspective, that you're actually, it's a direct mental interaction with living systems, but it's a form of PK. Yeah.
You know, there's just a wonderful intersection there with our work as house healers and how we affect, you know, living systems. And that's really one of the, you know, big reasons why I wanted to bring Kieran to this group to allow us to kind of explore what we do, not just from our kind of experiences and our beliefs, but also, you know, there's a potential scientific basis to what we do as well, which I absolutely love. So more questions? Nicholas.
Unmute.
Unmute, yes. I can't hear anything.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
You just touched on a question that I was going to ask you regarding PK. I was going to ask you, I mean, I don't know if you've ever done any dowsing in your time, in your research. With PK, you're talking about moving objects, and I was going to ask you if you've done any research in the fact that, say, for instance, within the human energy field of a person, I could perhaps, or one of us could go to another room and we could intentionally reduce or expand that field through our connection. Have you ever done any research in that sort of area with actually measuring the energy? We measure it with dowsing. We can measure the field with dowsing, obviously. We can put our intent into that person's energy field, and we can either shrink their energy field or we can expand it just with our intention, as is, for example, on the dark side, voodoo, for instance. Sure. They have the intention, but they have an object, and they can affect.
I was going to say, it's interesting what you say. I haven't done any research myself. In terms of the research I do, it's very much, you know, involved in haunting experiences, that side of things. But as parapsychologists, of course, we go through an extensive amount of training and qualifications. And I was based at the Institute of Parapsychology in North Carolina, Durham, North Carolina, for a while. And you hear about lots of research, and we very much kind of keep in touch with each other. It reminds me when you're talking about, so there's two things. Dowsing, I've got my own pair of rods at home that I have used on occasion, and I love the concept of it. I talked about ley lines briefly, didn't I, with the Dragon project, and kind of that's all linked with dowsing side of things. I haven't done that work experimentally. I'm somewhat skeptical of it, to be honest. But I think there's another side to it when you start to talk about, I think you were saying about kind of our energies or something, there's a proximity thing. I'm immediately reminded of the work of Rupert Sheldrake, who I don't know is a name if you discussed Rupert Sheldrake at all, and his concept of something called morphic resonance. That when you think about claims of telepathy, especially, that what is going on there, there are some theoretical explanations, but they're not sufficient. And Rupert Sheldrake, with kind of a background more in biology than anything else, put forward this idea based on the evidence that he had seen, that we have morphic fields. He didn't talk about auras, because auras is something different. You can talk about auras as kind of this present, this color sense around us, and people can aura read, and that can show emotions or various things, and other people can read it. He talked about morphic fields as in we have areas around us, and sometimes those can extend quite widely. But actually, the reason why you get telepathic communications, and very good examples of telepathic communication, is because our morphic fields interact, that they cross over. And that when we talk about, a lovely talk that he gave the analogy is, when we speak, how far does that voice go? How far does it go? If you shout, it goes further. Telepathy doesn't have those boundaries, but actually it's more significant when you've got people who are in closer proximity, but actually our morphic fields are a lot wider. So he talked about something similar to what you're saying, kind of this energy around us. But then he also kind of went one step further and said, well, it's living systems that have this energy field, and the morphic resonance is the interaction of the field. I don't know if that's the sort of thing that you were asking about. Is it that sort of thing, or is it something else?
Yeah, is it? I'm presuming this comes under the heading of PK. If you're talking, we're not moving objects, but we're moving energy. So the main question really was, I was going to lead on to, was, would it come under the form of PK, as because we are intentionally moving something with your energy? But I just wonder if you've ever done experiments and recorded it, as opposed to seeing something physically move. You can catch with your eyesight, but with dowsing, you can record it. Yes.
Yeah, you mean in terms of dowsing? How is that happening from a parapsychological perspective? Yeah, it's interesting, and it's interesting also talking to some dowsers as well about potentially what's going on. But although some dowsers don't talk about it in the context of a paranormal explanation, it's just an ability that you have. It's just kind of an accepted, especially some of the work that I've been doing on the witch farm and speaking to some Welsh farmers. They're like, oh, what are you talking about? It's nothing paranormal. It's just, that's like riding a bike. That's just what we do. They don't talk about it that way, but some of them talk about it in very much of either that the rods are the detectors. It's not them. The rods are the detectors. There's something going on with the rods. Others, however, and this is the majority, they talk about forming an association with the rods, and in terms of the process that you follow, it's that forming association with your rods. And because you form that association, you therefore are picking up on whatever you're looking for, the water or the energy, whatever it is, and then you are communicating that to the rods. And that for me feels like it's PK then, but a potential for PK. That you're walking along, you're in a particular environment, and you sense it, and then that is communicated to the rods. But psychologists would say the communication that happens doesn't have to be paranormal. It could actually be your brain communicating with the muscles, bypassing any conscious awareness. And it's just your brain going, oh, Kieran, you've discovered something. Let me tell your hands to move the rods. But it also happens, that's not quick enough. It happens quicker than that. So I would say my experience speaking to some of these individuals is I think it's a combination of things. How do they get that information in themselves that then is communicated to the rods? Are they picking up from that energy telepathically or something like that? The interesting thing is, when we think about dowsing though, picking up on those sources of energy, I would say is not PK by definition, because PK is actually the action of the mind on an object. So the PK element, if there is one, is the action of the mind on the rods. Does that make sense? So when you're walking around, and if you pick up on something, that's not PK.
Yes. Okay. No, the question was the intention, say for I have to reduce the energy field around you, although you can't visibly see it. Some people can, obviously. Just simply, would that be classed under PK, even though you? Oh,
I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Yes, I see what you mean. But then you'd have to get into an argument about that energy field. Is that a living system? And if you're able to argue that, you could argue that philosophically that it is a living system 100%. But I think it's a debate, because there'll be some parapsychologists that would say, no, we don't regard that as a living system. So because it's not a living system, it wouldn't be DMILS, it wouldn't be direct mental interaction, a living system. And also because you're talking about energy, it's not really what we would class on as PK. I would argue that it is. The way you've explained it now, because of the work that was done at Princeton. So look up Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory. And if you think about some of their research, and they did, over a decade of research, but one of the things was that effect of the decay of radioactive material. So they might be affecting the actual material, but actually they're affecting the decay. They're affecting a lot more than that. And some of the work of Brenda Dunn and Robert Yarn, who are involved in the Princeton theme, was actually people affecting energy fields like electric fields. Now that's not a living system, but also it's not a tangible object that you can touch like this laptop or this book. It's equatable with what you're saying, that people are affecting that electric field in some way. Well, it's not a huge leap then to go, well, I'm not talking about electric fields, I'm talking about energy fields, regardless of what that energy is, and are you affecting it some way? So 100%, let's agree from my perspective that it sounds like PK influence.
Okay, thank you.
It was a long time to get there. So I appreciate your patience, Richard, in terms of me answering that question, but fascinating.
Oh my
Thank
goodness, it's such a font of knowledge. Other questions? Sally.
Hello, I think I must be just down the road from you. I'm very close to West Wickham. And one of my favourite places where I felt a ghost was Hampton Court.
Fantastic.
So it's very interesting that you mentioned both. My question is, when you go to these places and you find what you perceive to be a ghost, are you trying to move those ghosts on? What are you actually doing with those ghosts? I mean, we try as house feelers, obviously, to move them on.
Yeah.
So what is it that you actually do?
Yeah, so I very, very different perspective. So it's not about me visiting these places and perceiving a ghost. If anything, you speak to colleagues, you speak to individuals that I'm involved in this research on, and frequently they'll say, this was a haunted place till Kieran walked in. We're not going to see any ghosts now because he's here. They see me as being skeptical to the extent of cynical. It's not actually true, but my research at places like Hampton Court Palace and Hellfire Caves and other locations is more about understanding people's experiences. But here's the perspective that I'm taking. You know, from a young age, I've been fascinated by ghosts. The film Ghostbusters has been my iconic driver for the last 35 plus years. Frequently, skeptics put forward explanations for people's haunting experiences that are things like electromagnetic fields, infrasound, suggestion, belief, you name it, either the environment or psychology. I think it's arrogant of scientists like myself to ignore people's experiences and to not investigate them and find out what's going on. But it's equally a responsibility of somebody like myself. If a skeptic says infrasound can explain people's haunting experiences, there's a responsibility to go, okay, you've got maybe some evidence there. We're going to test that now, which is exactly why I talked about infrasound. Here was a claim that is almost become part of the ghost hunting narrative. You can see it in lots of ghost shows. Infrasound explains people's haunting experiences. Because of the work of Vic Tandy and this idea of this 18 hertz, my role in researching these locations is to test the idea of the paranormal and the normal, but to question everything. So Vic Tandy's research, because of my research, we're basically turning around going, that's rubbish. Infrasound does not explain people's experiences. People are having these experiences anyway. Infrasound is just adding to the intensity of that experience. So to answer your question, there are two approaches that I take when I go into a haunted location. One is my parapsychology hat, which is testing these theories, gathering people's experiences and their accounts of their experiences and trying to get an understanding of, is it EMF, is it infrasound, is it belief, is it suggestion, humidity, temperature, 20, 30, 40 different possible explanations, but testing them, because we need to be as robust as scientists can be in showing that there is evidence for these things. And I published a paper recently, Things That Go Bump in the Literature, which was saying, look, all of these environmental explanations are put forward by skeptics as possible explanations for haunting experiences. But actually, when you look at the last 20 to 30 years of research, the evidence is not there. It's not there at all when we talk about all of these things. So that's one hat I have, which is parapsychology. The other hat I wear is a ghost hunter hat, a ghost buster hat. So on the weekends and various evenings, you'll find me going into a location, but it's a very, very different motivation. And that is in the hope of having an experience myself, but to also be with people who are having experiences and to witness them having those experiences, and potentially capture evidence, but in a very different way. As a parapsychologist, I would never be capturing EVPs or looking at photographs or video, but as a ghost hunter, I'm interested in capturing that sort of evidence. So I hope that answers your question, which is a long-winded way of saying it's not about me perceiving ghosts. I'm not doing anything in the same way you as a kind of a house healing group kind of have, a particular aim. It's about research fundamentally, and also that little, boyhood dream of being a Ghostbuster as well, and going in and being able to shout, "We've got one." That would be my ultimate aim as well.
Thank you.
Is it Karen? So I'm just trying to look. Did you have
Kieran, yeah, I'm also Kieran.
Kieran.
Spelled differently.
Did you have a question, Kieran?
I think Kieran basically answered it. I was just interested it took me a while to understand that he was basically, or like your profession is about collecting empirical evidence.
Yes.
And about using terminology which is accepted in a field of people who are also collecting empirical evidence.
Exactly.
And so, because I wanted to know, do you know who, do you communicate with your guides? And like Sally, are you passing the ghosts or the spirits to the place where they can rest or move on to the next life? So, but that's been answered. Thank you. Very interesting.
I mean, again, there's another side to this, which is, so that professional kind of scientist hat, which is my parapsychology hat, it feels as though the two lives or two hats don't equate. You've got a scientific hat, but you've also got the boyhood ghost hunter that goes out at weekends and ghost hunt. But actually they do equate, and they almost equate accidentally, because of course they're looking at the same phenomena. But then my field experience investigating poltergeists and investigating haunting experiences has now fed back into parapsychology, because up until very recently, all parapsychologists would say hauntings and poltergeists are two separate things. We've got to treat them as two separate things. My experience now is turning around and going, yes, whilst we define poltergeists in a particular way or hauntings in a particular way, actually we're categorizing them, we're labeling them, and that's potentially dangerous. We're immediately pigeonholing phenomena into, is it a poltergeist case or is it a haunting case? Whereas I know from my experience investigating these things, there is such a huge crossover.
And there are all these spirits which you would never pick up because they're just waiting to be, to be found and helped, or don't have the energy to make themselves heard or seen by people who are not mediums.
Exactly.
Like so many of them. So yeah.
My favorite phrase that they said when I was out in California at some point, when I was interviewed about this sort of stuff, and they said, oh, you're cynical about this sort of stuff and you probably think there's nothing around. And I go, well, no, I'm not cynical, I'm skeptical, which means I'm open-minded to questioning, but there's potential here. Anywhere somebody has lived, laughed and loved, there's potential for spirit. You've got to recognize that. If you think about these things in that way and think about the experiences that people are having, but also think about that kind of philosophical approach of that's what spirits are, then yeah, of course you've got to think about it that way. Wherever people have lived, laughed and loved, there's potential for spirits.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Agreed. So Shannon, you're going to be the last question of our session. So over to you, Shannon.
Thank you. I was wondering, in your opinion, the infrasound in the pipes in the churches, what do you really think that they're put there for? I mean, I understand they can impact on the sound, but we can't hear it. Do you think it's for another reason?
Why do I think the pipes are put into these church organs?
Yes,
yeah,
the infrasound ones.
I think it's to add a sense of profundity. I've stood in St Albans Cathedral and stood in Westminster Cathedral, and I've stood there when the organist is playing a piece of music and then said to him at some point, without telling me, press the infrasonic pipe. And I've stood there listening to the music, and then I will feel it, and I'll feel a sense of awe. That's the best way I can explain it. And it's almost as though infrasound in a particular context will give you the experience associated with that context. So in a cathedral, there's a sense of awe and religiosity and profundity anyway. Add the infrasound and that just becomes heightened. It's almost like a sense of presence. In a haunted environment, the infrasound, you'll have your experiences that, it's spooky, haunting experiences. You add infrasound and it increases that intensity. So I think that's maybe what's happening. We know from classical composers, Messiaen is a prime example, that they would write in infrasound into their music to add to the weight and the sense of awe associated with the music. So some composers deliberately added infrasound. There you go. Good
I guess
question.
Sorry, it was bothering me because it's detrimentally affects us. So I'm like, well, why do they have it blasting in churches? So that's why. But
it's interesting.
Right.
It's interesting you say detrimental, because prolonged exposure would be detrimental.
Okay.
Even to the extent where 5 minutes or so, actually it's not detrimental to that effect. There will be individual differences, of course. If you have particular sensitive hearing, that would be something to be concerned about. You're very close to the source as well. That's something to be concerned about. But no, it's more about prolonged exposure. And also infrasound below 20 hertz, you still have that capability of turning it up. We talk about decibel level. So you can have infrasound that's low, as in low decibels, it's very quiet, but you can have infrasound that's very loud as well. So you can imagine prolonged exposure that's very loud when it's infrasound, high decibels, can be detrimental, but not in terms of, within an organ piece or within a cathedral context. It wouldn't be detrimental to that effect.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Shannon.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Kieran, for your
No, thank you,
time
Dawn.
and your knowledge and your expertise. I've, as always, just fascinated by your perspective. And you've said a number of occasions I'm not cynical, and that is not how I've ever perceived you. I think you really hold the tension between looking for that empirical evidence and the kind of the maybe the hope even that there is something out there. So as a parapsychologist, you are not on that kind of extreme skeptical, closed-minded side, and I think that really adds to the strength. So thank you so much for what you do in the world. I will put some links in our Facebook group to Kieran's School of Parapsychology, and they are amazing programs. You get to Zoom with Kieran as he takes you through the literature, the research, prompts you to think about things from a totally different lens. And it's just an amazing experience. I'm partway through my journey of parapsychology with Kieran. So, and a wonderful course on poltergeists. And if you're into demons, there's also a demonology course as well in there as well. So I will put all of those links there. Kieran, if you could send us any of those links you were talking about, I'll pop them in the Facebook group as well.
Will do. Thank you very much.
Really, just thank you so much for spending your time with us. I personally think it's been fascinating.
Thank you.
Vibration.
Vibration, indeed. So I will look forward to seeing you all next month. We'll announce the our guest speaker once we've confirmed that. Thank you for tuning in to our network meeting again. Have a great rest of your day and a month. So we see you in December. That's a bit scary, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. Right.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.